The world has seen many debates, but never one like this. In Geneva, a young African captain stood face to face with Donald Trump. And what happened next left the entire world speechless. His words shook the powerful, ignited millions across Africa, and sparked a movement that cannot be ignored. This was not just a debate, it was history in the making. The cameras captured every second as the international summit began in Geneva. The event was not just another diplomatic gathering. It was a stage where the most powerful voices of the world were expected to outline their visions for the future of global cooperation. The hall was filled with leaders, diplomats, journalists, and observers from every continent. Flags representing dozens of nations lined the stage, giving the room an air of symbolism and gravity. Everyone present understood that the words spoken here would travel far beyond these walls. They would echo into homes, schools, and offices around the world. At the center of this high-profile event sat former United States President Donald Trump. Known for his blunt manner of speaking, he carried himself with the same boldness that had often made him a polarizing figure on the world stage. Leaning back in his chair with confidence, he surveyed the room. His voice, amplified by the microphones, cut across the atmosphere of expectation. He claimed that without America's involvement, Africa would not have achieved even basic progress. He suggested that electricity infrastructure and development were the result of Western efforts. His hand moved dismissively, as though he were brushing aside centuries of African history and resilience. The words struck the room with force. For a few moments, silence hung heavy in the air. Diplomats and journalists shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some bowed their heads, unable to meet the eyes of their African colleagues. The remark was not only controversial, but also dismissive of the struggles, achievements, and sacrifices made by African nations and their people. A few members of the audience tried to hide their reactions, but their clenched jaws and nervous movements betrayed their discomfort. The statement had landed like a spark in a room filled with dry tinder. It was in that exact moment that Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the young leader of Burkina Faso, leaned forward. Dressed in immaculate military attire, he carried an air of calmness and authority. His expression was firm but not aggressive. He reached for the microphone with steady hands, signaling that he was ready to speak. The cameras quickly turned toward him, and suddenly all attention shifted. The tension in the room grew as the audience sensed that something significant was about to unfold. When Traoré spoke, his words were not shouted. They were measured, calm, and yet carried a force that pierced through the noise of politics. He accused Trump of assuming ownership over a continent that was never his to claim. "You think you own Africa," he said, his voice controlled but sharp. "You do not even own your conscience." The statement landed with a weight that could not be ignored. Gasps erupted across the studio. Some journalists dropped their pens as they scrambled to record the moment. Others simply froze, recognizing instantly that history was unfolding before their eyes. Trump, who was rarely caught off guard, visibly flinched. The confident smirk faded, replaced by a look of unease. He blinked rapidly, as if unsure whether he had measured or whether the challenge was truly so direct. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every flicker of his reaction. For the first time in the session, the balance of power seemed to shift. The world was watching a confrontation unlike any seen before. The air in the studio became heavy, almost suffocating, as the reality of what had just happened settled in. The moderator glanced nervously at her notes, trying to anticipate how the discussion would continue. Journalists whispered urgently into their recorders and phones, eager to be the first to share the breaking moment with the outside world. Every camera in the room was locked onto Traoré, his calm expression contrasting with the storm his words had just unleashed. His presence was commanding not because he raised his voice, but because he spoke with a truth that resonated deeply. The audience, still in shock, began to react. Some nodded subtly in agreement. Others exchanged looks that revealed both astonishment and admiration. The weight of Traoré's statement was not confined to the walls of the studio. across Africa and in other parts of the world, the broadcast was being watched live. Millions of people witnessed the young African leader standing firm against one of the most influential figures of the modern era. On social media platforms, clips of the exchange began to spread within seconds. Comments poured in from Johannesburg, Dakar, Paris, London, and Washington. For Africans watching from home, the moment felt personal. It was not just about politics or diplomacy. It was about dignity, respect, and the assertion of a voice that had too often been silenced or overshadowed. In rural villages, in urban cafes, in crowded schools, people repeated his words to one another, stunned that someone had dared to say them so openly on such a stage. In homes, families watched the broadcast and felt a surge of pride as they saw one of their own confront global arrogance with clarity and courage. Inside the studio, the atmosphere was electric. Every person in the room understood that they were witnessing a historic confrontation. The tension was no longer just about political disagreements. It was about power, identity, and the right of Africa to define itself without being reduced to a Western narrative. Ibrahim Traoré had not only spoken for his nation, he had spoken for millions across a continent who had long waited for such a declaration. The silence after Ibrahim Traoré's first statement lingered like a shadow, but he was not finished. The young Burkinabe leader straightened in his chair, his military uniform gleaming under the bright lights of the studio. His presence was magnetic. He did not need to shout or pound the table to command attention. His voice was steady, calm, but it carried the weight of centuries of history. He spoke not only as a leader of his country, but as a representative of an entire continent. He began by addressing the myth that Africa had been built by outsiders. His tone was deliberate, each word carefully chosen. He reminded the room that Africa was a continent of ancient civilizations, of builders, thinkers, and warriors who had created great societies long before the arrival of colonial powers. The pyramids, the libraries of Timbuktu, the kingdoms of Mali and Songhai, the vast trading networks stretching across deserts and oceans, these were not gifts from the West. They were achievements born from Africa's own ingenuity, resilience, and strength. Traoré emphasized that Africa was not a blank slate waiting to be written upon. It was not an empty land handed progress by foreign hands. Instead, it was a continent that had endured centuries of exploitation, yet had never lost its identity or spirit. He pointed out that even during colonial rule, Africans resisted in ways big and small, refusing to be erased or silenced. His words were sharp but dignified, a reminder that Africa's history did not begin with colonization, and it certainly would not end with dependence on the West. The camera zoomed in on his face as he leaned slightly closer to the microphone. He spoke of the dignity of African people, the mothers who held their families together through hardship, the fathers who worked fields that had been stripped of resources, the children who walked miles to school with hope in their hearts. We are not statistics, he declared firmly. We are human beings with dreams, with strength, with a history written in our own blood and sacrifice. The room fell utterly silent. Even the sound of shuffling papers had stopped. Across the studio, journalists scribbled frantically, trying to capture his words, knowing they were recording a moment that would be replayed for years to come. A veteran reporter from South Africa whispered to a colleague that this was the speech of a generation, one that would inspire countless Africans to see their worth beyond Western approval. A young intern, not African herself, blinked back tears as she realized the depth of the injustice being challenged. Traoré then turned his attention back to Trump, though his words were directed far beyond the man in front of him. Africa is not your playground, he said with unwavering conviction. It is not a place for power games or for profit. It is a land of people, of builders, of warriors, of dreamers. We will not be reduced to the background of your narrative. His voice rose slightly, not in anger, but in strength, each syllable carrying the determination of a people long denied their rightful place at the table. The reaction from the audience was visceral. Some gasped again, others nodded slowly, recognizing the truth of his statement. The moderator herself looked shaken, unsure whether to intervene or allow the moment to flow. Her hands trembled slightly as she held her pen, yet she did not interrupt. She too sensed that history was being written, not by her questions, but by the answers unfolding before her. As his words echoed through the studio, they traveled far beyond Geneva. In Lagos, students watching on a cracked television erupted in applause, repeating his phrases like a chant. In Nairobi, a cafe fell silent as customers leaned in to hear his declaration replayed on the evening news. In Bamako, children huddled around a radio, whispering to one another with pride that their voices had finally been carried to the world stage. For many, Traoré's declaration was more than just a rebuttal to Trump. It was a restoration of dignity, a reminder that Africa was not a charity case, not a dependent continent waiting for foreign aid. It was a place of potential, resilience, and pride. His words tapped into something buried deep within the African spirit, a truth that had always existed, but had rarely been spoken so openly on a global stage. The weight of his speech was not lost on the millions following online. Social media platforms were ablaze with hashtags celebrating his courage. Young Africans shared clips with captions like, "At last, someone speaks for us." Older generations nodded with tears in their eyes, grateful to witness a leader bold enough to say aloud what they had always known. His words became a rallying cry, echoing through living rooms, classrooms, and crowded streets across the continent. In that moment, Traoré's calm but powerful declaration dismantled centuries of stereotypes. He was not only defending his people's dignity, he was reminding the entire world that Africa was not a story written by outsiders. It was a story written by Africans themselves, one chapter at a time, with resilience, with sacrifice, and with a future that belonged to them alone. The exchange between Ibrahim Traoré and Donald Trump had barely ended when the ripple of reaction began to spread across the world. Inside the studio, the silence was still heavy, but outside those walls, the impact was immediate. Within seconds, journalists were typing furiously, reporters were whispering into microphones, and social media platforms were flooded with fragments of Traoré's words. The clip of him declaring that Africa was not a playground, and that Trump did not even own his conscience, began circulating before the debate had even moved to its next question. In Johannesburg, a crowded cafe erupted into cheers as the broadcast played on a large television screen. Young men and women stood up from their chairs, clapping and raising their fists in the air. One student shouted, "Finally someone said it," while others nodded with tears in their eyes. For them, this was not merely about politics. It was about representation, pride, and the validation of voices that had long been dismissed. The air in that cafe was electric, filled with a mixture of disbelief and joy that an African leader had spoken with such honesty on the world stage. In Paris, students gathered in universities replayed the clip again and again on their phones. Heated debates broke out in lecture halls and cafes as young Africans in the diaspora expressed how deeply Traoré's words touched them. Many had grown up hearing condescending remarks about their homeland. Now, watching the clip, they felt a sense of vindication. They shared the video widely, using it as proof that Africa had leaders who were unafraid to confront global powers directly. Meanwhile, in Lagos, entire neighborhoods tuned in through radios and televisions. In one community center, university students sat together around an old television. The image slightly blurred, but the voice of Traoré loud and clear. When he said, "You think you own Africa," the room shook with applause. One student jumped up, shouting, "That is our captain! That is our leader!" The crowd roared in agreement, their voices echoing into the night. The pride was palpable, and for many it felt like a historic shift in how Africa could be seen by the world. The reaction was not confined to Africa alone. In Washington, a young African-American journalist sat at her desk in a newsroom, her eyes wet with tears as she replayed the clip. She typed a headline that would soon spread across global news sites: "An African leader finally speaks the truth." She whispered softly to herself, "He spoke for all of us." Across the Atlantic in Harlem, a grandmother watching the broadcast clutched her chest and whispered a prayer of protection for Traoré. For her, his words were not only political, they were spiritual, a beacon of hope in a world that had long treated Africa as secondary. In rural Mali, children gathered in a schoolyard where a teacher had brought in a radio to let them hear the baby. When Traoré's words echoed through the static, the children repeated them, their small voices rising in unison, "Africa is not your playground." Their teacher, eyes glistening with emotion, smiled as she realized that the moment was shaping a new generation of Africans who would grow up proud of their heritage. The global press recognized the significance immediately. Headlines across Europe, Asia, and the Americas described the confrontation as historic, unprecedented, and transformative. Analysts on live broadcasts called it a turning point in international relations. One South African journalist reporting live whispered into her microphone, "This is no longer politics. This is history being written before our eyes." On social media, hashtags surged within minutes, Faye Africa Speaks, Fa Traoré Truth, Ha Global Wake Up. Millions of users shared clips, added their own commentary, and engaged in discussions that cut across cultures and languages. Videos of the speech trended in Johannesburg, Nairobi, Paris, New York, and even in cities like Rio de Janeiro and Sydney. In every corner of the globe, people were tuning in, discussing, and reacting. Ordinary citizens were not the only ones affected. Leaders in other African nations watched closely, some with admiration, others with caution, knowing that the boldness of Traoré's words might spark debates in their own countries. Activists in the diaspora began organizing online forums to discuss the importance of reclaiming Africa's dignity. Professors paused their lectures in universities around the world to show students the clip, using it as a lesson in truth, telling, and courage. Even those who were not African felt the resonance of his words. In Dhaka, an old man listening to the broadcast on his small radio dropped his cane, overwhelmed by the weight of what he had just heard. In a small town in Italy, a group of migrant workers gathered around a smartphone, nodding silently as they replayed the clip again and again. The message of dignity and resistance transcended borders, striking a chord with people who had felt overlooked, oppressed, or undervalued. Inside the studio, the tension was still heavy, but the outside world had already moved into a state of eruption. Traoré's words had crossed oceans in seconds, igniting discussions not only about Africa's dignity, but about the very nature of global politics. The power of his calm, firm declaration was undeniable. It was not just a moment in a summit, it was a movement being born in real time, one that would grow with every replay, every headline, and every whispered conversation around the world. Donald Trump was not a man easily shaken on stage. For years, he had thrived in the spotlight, relying on confidence and bravado to dominate conversations. Yet in Geneva, after Ibrahim Traoré's sharp words, the usual swagger was gone. The cameras caught him leaning forward, his eyes darting briefly to his notes, then back toward the young African captain. His lips parted as if to respond quickly, but nothing came out. For a moment, the silence that followed was louder than anything he could have said. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried a tremor. He attempted to regain control of the narrative by pointing to America's record of giving billions in aid to Africa. "You should be thanking us," he said, his tone half defensive, half mocking. He leaned on the familiar argument that the United States had been a generous benefactor, implying that Africa owed its progress to Western financial assistance. To some in the audience, it sounded like a rehearsed defense. To others, it was a desperate attempt to mask the sting of Traoré's rebuke. The words hung in the air, but they did not land as Trump intended. Traoré's reaction was immediate, though calm. He did not raise his voice or rush his response. Instead, he leaned slightly forward, his eyes fixed on Trump with an unshakable steadiness. "You gave us loans with chains," he said. "Aid with cameras and deals written in fine print that killed farmers. You gave with one hand while the other took twice as much." The studio erupted in murmurs, journalists flipping through their notes to capture the exact phrasing. The cameras zoomed in, capturing Trump's jaw tightening as the words sliced through the polished narrative of Western benevolence. For years, aid had been framed as charity, a lifeline extended by powerful nations to the so-called underdeveloped world. Yet here, on live international television, Traoré had stripped that narrative bare. He painted it not as a gift, but as an exchange that often left African nations poorer, bound by debt, and robbed of sovereignty. His words resonated with millions watching from across the globe. In African households, families nodded in agreement, having seen firsthand how aid was followed by conditions, how resources were extracted, and how promises of partnership too often turned into cycles of dependence. Trump attempted to chuckle dismissively, waving his hand as though brushing aside the seriousness of the accusation. "Here we go again," he said. "Blame America, blame success." But his laughter was forced, and the audience was no longer amused. The atmosphere in the studio was tense, every word dissected, every gesture magnified. Trump's usual command of the stage had slipped, and for the first time he appeared cornered. Meanwhile, Traoré remained unshaken. His posture was upright, his voice calm, his delivery precise. "We are not blaming success," he said. "We are blaming the silence that followed your success when that success was built on our pain." The phrase cut sharply, landing with a moral weight that the former American president could not counter. Cameras captured the moment Trump's expression shifted, part disbelief, part frustration, and part recognition that he had no easy response. Behind the scenes, Trump's advisors leaned into each other, whispering urgently. One aide muttered, "We did not expect Traoré to be this bold." Another added nervously, the clips are already spreading. Their concern was justified. In real time, social media platforms were exploding with reactions. The video was being replayed endlessly, and commentators were labeling the exchange as historic. The moderator, herself a seasoned journalist from the BBC, tried to intervene, sensing that the discussion was veering off script. She shifted in her chair and suggested moving to the topic of foreign aid more broadly. Yet Traoré raised his hand gently, signaling that he was not finished. "If we skip the truth now," he said firmly, "it will return to haunt us louder." The moderator froze. Even she recognized that control of the conversation had slipped away. This was no longer a debate she could manage. It had become something larger, something beyond her authority. Trump tried once more to steady himself. His voice rose slightly as he insisted that American aid had saved lives, built infrastructure, and provided opportunities. But his arguments now sounded defensive, stripped of their former confidence. The audience was no longer convinced by the surface-level rhetoric. Traoré had shifted the frame. He had exposed the underlying power dynamics of aid, and once exposed, they could not be unseen. The contrast between the two leaders was stark. Trump, known for his loud and dominating style, appeared rattled, his laughter shallow and his points repetitive. Traoré, by contrast, embodied calm strength, speaking less but saying more. Every phrase he delivered seemed to carry the weight of millions of voices, the collective memory of exploitation, and the unyielding demand for dignity. By the time the exchange drew to a pause, the power balance in the room had shifted dramatically. Trump was no longer in control of the narrative. His attempts to reframe aid as generosity were overshadowed by the uncomfortable truths Traoré had laid bare. The young African captain had placed him on the defensive, and the world had witnessed it live. The moment the debate concluded, the energy in the studio lingered like a storm cloud that refused to pass. The applause was uneven. Some clapped out of respect for the event, others for the courage they had just witnessed. But outside, beyond those walls, the reaction was far from restrained. Across Africa, the diaspora, and much of the wider world, the words of Ibrahim Traoré began to ripple like waves striking every shore at once. In Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, people poured into the streets within hours of the broadcast. Car horns blared, flags waved, and chants filled the night sky. Young men and women held up posters with Traoré's image, some bearing the words, "Our voice," while others simply read, "Dignity." Mothers lifted their children onto their shoulders so they could see the celebrations. For them, this was more than politics. It was history. They were living in a moment that their grandparents had only dreamed of, a moment when an African leader could stand tall before the world's most powerful figures and refuse to bow. In Dakar, Accra, and Nairobi, similar scenes unfolded. Cafes turned into gathering spots where televisions replayed the clip on loop. Groups crowded around small screens, shouting and cheering each time Traoré's words echoed. You gave with one hand, while the other took twice as much. Many compared it to the speeches of revolutionary figures from decades past. Kwame Nkrumah, Thomas Sankara, Patrice Lumumba. On social media, users were calling Traoré the Sankara of our time, and hashtags honoring him trended for days. The younger generation, often dismissed as politically disinterested, suddenly found a leader whose words resonated with their frustrations and aspirations. The diaspora responded with equal passion. In Paris, African students spilled onto the streets, waving flags of multiple nations, chanting songs of unity. He spoke for all of us, one student declared into a camera, his voice breaking with emotion. In London, university halls hosted impromptu forums where young Africans and allies discussed the significance of the debate, comparing Traoré's calm defiance to the global leaders who once fought for independence. In New York, African-American activists drew parallels between his words and the long struggle for dignity faced by marginalized communities across the globe. His speech became more than a defense of Africa. It became a symbol of resistance against systems of exploitation everywhere. The international media amplified the reaction. Headlines appeared on the front pages of major outlets. Traoré challenges the West head on Africa's voice echoes in Geneva, and Trump outshone by young captains. Analysts on television dissected every phrase, marveling at how a man so young could dismantle decades of political narratives in a few sentences. Commentators in Africa described it as a breaking point, a moment that would be remembered as a milestone in the continent's modern history. But not all reactions were celebratory. In Washington, diplomats held tense meetings, worrying that Traoré's words might embolden other African nations to resist Western policies. Aid agreements, trade deals, and military partnerships suddenly seemed more fragile. In Paris, government officials monitored the growing protests among African communities in France, fearful that the rhetoric of independence and dignity might fuel deeper unrest. In corporate boardrooms, executives quietly discussed the implications for mining contracts, oil deals, and agricultural imports. For them, Traoré's speech was not just fairy rhetoric, it was a direct challenge to the financial systems that tied Africa to Western economies. Meanwhile, in villages far from the bustle of cities, ordinary people felt a renewed sense of pride. In a small town in Ghana, elders gathered around a wooden table listening to a radio broadcast. One of them, his face lined with decades of struggle, smiled faintly and said, "The boy has spoken like a man of all Africa." In Kenya, school children were asked to write essays about the meaning of dignity after their teacher played them the debate on a projector. In Nigeria, a market woman sold vegetables while playing the clip on her phone, telling her customers, "This is the leader we have been waiting for." For many, it was not only about what Traoré said, but how he said it. His calm tone, his refusal to be intimidated, and his sharp use of truth gave his words a lasting power. People contrasted this with the bluster and defensiveness of Trump, who seemed shaken in a way few had ever seen before. To Africans across the world, it was proof that dignity did not require shouting or anger. It required courage, clarity, and conviction. The legacy of that exchange began to solidify almost immediately. Universities announced upcoming lectures about the Geneva moment. Activists launched campaigns under slogans inspired by Traoré's work. Musicians sampled his speech in new tracks that spread quickly online. Even comedians referenced the debate in their routines, turning Trump's stumbles into punchlines while celebrating Traoré's composure. For Africans everywhere, whether in bustling cities, remote villages, or scattered across the diaspora, the event was more than a debate. It was a collective awakening, a reminder that Africa was not voiceless, not powerless, and not dependent on the approval of the West to stand tall. It marked a shift in consciousness that spread far beyond Burkina Faso, igniting a fire of pride and possibility across the entire continent.